Welcome to Next Anatomy. Topic of discussion cerebrum. When you talk about the developmental phases from the prosencephalon, that develops into telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon develops into cerebral hemispheres and the lateral ventricle. So the title of discussion will be cerebrum. So we have is the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. So they have been interconnected by the corpus callosum. So the cerebral hemispheres are developed from the telencephalon, which is the largest part of the brain. And when you study the osteology of the skull, interior of the skull, we had anterior, middle, and posterior cranial fossa. Here, the total anterior cranial fossa, middle cranial fossa will be occupied by the cerebrum, and in the posterior cranial fossa, the tentorium cerebelli will differentiates the occipital lobe of the brain from the brainstem cerebellum. And mainly they constitutes the gray matter and the white matter, also basal nuclei and with a cavity of lateral ventricle. Cerebral hemispheres are separated by a sickle-shaped fold of dura mater called as falx cerebri. We studied the dural folds attaching from the crista galli to the superior aspect of the tentorium cerebelli. We had is the falx cerebri. Even in the dural folds, to add a note on it, falx cerebri, cerebelli, tentorium cerebelli, all those things you have studied. So here the cerebral hemispheres are separated by falx cerebri. As said that right and left cerebral hemispheres are connected by corpus callosum. Tentorium cerebelli separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. So when you are going to study the cerebral hemisphere, the cerebral cortex surface got increased and they were being thrown into folds called as gyri, and they are separated by fissures called as sulci. So we do name the sulci and the gyri. When you are going to study the cerebral hemisphere, you could able to see you can see the photograph of the three views of the cerebrum. This can be termed as the superolateral surface. This is on the medial side, so we'll study under the medial surface. And this will be studied under the inferior surface. So while you are studying the surfaces, we need to make a comment on what are all the poles and borders and their surfaces. Poles of the cerebrum. The anterior end of the brain itself is your frontal pole, which is exactly opposite to the superciliary arch. The posterior end of the brain, the cerebrum, that's called as occipital pole, exactly at the level of external occipital protuberance. And the lateral most aspect is the lateral end called as temporal pole, related to the lesser wing of sphenoid and the junction between the frontal and the temporal lobes. So we have frontal, occipital, and the temporal poles. As mentioned earlier, we had three surfaces: superolateral surface, which is convex; medial surface, which is flat; inferior surface, which is irregular in shape. Superolateral surface occupies the cranial vault of the skull. Medial surface is a thick C-shaped surface which has been attached by the corpus callosum. The inferior surface lies in the both the cranial fossas, anterior and middle cranial fossa. and they will be studied under a smaller orbital part and a larger tentorial surface. We have is the borders: superomedial border, superciliary border, inferolateral border, medial orbital, infromedial, and medial occipital borders. So as we already know the superolateral surface and the medial surface, at the junction between the superolateral surface and the medial surface is called as your superomedial border. Inferior surface will have two parts, smaller orbital part and a larger tentorial part. So the smaller orbital part and the superolateral surface were being separated by a border, superciliary border. A larger tentorial surface and the superolateral surface will be separated by inferolateral border. And you see the medial surface and you are going to see the smaller orbital inferior surface. They were being separated by medial bond. And later now you will be studying the inferior surface. At the tentorial part, you will study uncus and parahippocampal gyrus. So between uncus and parahippocampal gyrus to the medial surface, I'm going to term them as infiromedial border. And total medial surface and the tentorial surface will be separated by the medial occipital border. In this photograph, you could able to identify the superolateral surface. You can see the frontal pole. Then you could able to term them as the occipital pole, and the lateral most view you can call them as the temporal pole. And inferior surface also here I can able to term as the occipital pole and the frontal pole. And few borders also can be mentioned, the opposite medial surface and here the superolateral surface. Here I could able to term them as superomedial border. And the temporal lobe towards to the medial side and the inferior side I can able to term them as inferolateral border. You're supposed to understand in the inferior surface, here I have an orbital surface. Towards to the superolateral border, I'm going to call them a superciliary border. The orbital surface towards to the medial surface, I'm being termed as separated by medial orbital border. Same previously we said that inferior surface tentorial part will have hippocampal and uncus. To the medial surface, I'm separated by medial occipital border. And the inferior surface to the superolateral surface, I am being separated by inferolateral border. That's what all the borders can be shown in different surfaces. Now we will be learning about the sulci and gyres. We have main sulci are the lateral sulcus or the Sylvian sulcus, which separates the superolateral surface from the temporal lobe. So means I can say superolateral surface means the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe are separated from the temporal lobes. So here this is the frontal, this is the parietal. And try to observe here there is a sulcus which is going inside. Here also you could able to identify. So now this sulcus is called as your lateral sulcus, separating superolateral surface nor frontal parietal from the temporal lobe. Then you have another sulcus called a central sulcus or central sulcus of Rolando. In the superolateral surface, they were been separating the frontal and the parietal lobes. Even the central sulcus will even extend into the medial surface also. So here you can able to see the very clear sulcus, the central sulcus, differentiating the frontal lobe and the parietal lobes to be remembered. Here also you could able to identify the central sulcus on the medial side. Then we have is the Parieto-occipital sulcus. Differentiates the superolateral surface from the occipital lobe. That's why we say that medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere also extended into the superolateral surface. So this parieto-occipital surface now will differentiates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. Lateral sulcus, central sulcus, parieto-occipital sulcus. Now the lateral sulcus has differentiated the superolateral surface from the temporal lobe. So who are there in my superolateral surface? Frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. They were being separated by the central sulcus. Parietal lobe and the occipital lobe, they were being separated by the parieto-occipital sulcus. So we have, after learning the sulcus, we will be having different lobes. These sulci has differentiated into frontal lobe in front of the central sulcus and above the lateral sulcus. I'm going to call them as frontal lobe. Behind the central sulcus. So now you are going to call them as the parietal lobe. Then next you had is the below the lateral sulcus, you had is the temporal lobe. Behind the parieto-occipital sulcus, you'll have is the occipital lobe. So we have frontal, we have is the parietal, we have is the temporal, and we have is the occipital lobes of the brain. You can observe even by colorations, frontal, parietal, temporal, and occipital separated by lateral, central, and parieto-occipital sulcus. I made a very simpler tabulation, ease of to identify. In the frontal lobe, you also have parallel to the central sulcus. I have is the precentral sulcus. And we have is the subsulci is called as superior frontal, inferior frontal sulci will differentiates into superior, middle, and inferior frontal gyrus. Try to identify, learn this diagram very carefully. This is the central sulcus. Now this is the lateral sulcus. So in front of the central sulcus and above the lateral sulcus, you have is your total frontal lobe. Central sulcus in front, you have one more sulcus called as precentral sulcus. And from them, you get your subsulci called as superior frontal sulci and the inferior frontal sulci. Thereby, we try to name them as precentral gyrus, which is between the central and the precentral gyrus. Between superior and inferior frontal sulci, I have superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and inferior frontal gyrus. While the stem of the lateral sulcus is going on, now they were being divided into anterior, ascending, and posterior sulci. You could able to look it on. Ascending one, anterior one, and the posterior one will have differentiated them into three smaller gyruses in the inferior frontal gyrus. So thereby the frontal lobe is done. Then we move on to the parietal lobe. You have is the postcentral sulcus. And from that I got my inferior parietal sulci. Thereby we differentiated into the superior parietal and inferior parietal lobule. Try to see the central sulcus again. Behind the central sulcus, you had is the postcentral sulcus. Between that, you had postcentral gyrus. From the postcentral sulci, I got off my subsulci called as intraparietal sulci, which has differentiated them into superior parietal lobule and the inferior parietal lobule. In parallelly, the stem of the lateral sulcus has given off the posterior sulci, which is now extending into the inferior parietal lobule. And again, you will be studying temporal lobe shortly. The superior and inferior temporal sulci are also extending into the parietal lobule. So now here I have lateral sulcus, posterior ramus, superior and inferior temporal sulci also. Thereby they differentiates in the inferior parietal lobule. Between the postcentral sulcus and the posterior ramus, in the inferior parietal lobule, we have supramarginal gyrus. Then between the stem of the posterior ramus and the superior temporal, I could able to identify angular gyrus. Then the inferior temporal sulci emerges over here with the inferior parietal lobule. Up till now, we have done the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Now we are entering into the temporal lobe. We have superior temporal and inferior temporal sulci will differentiate into superior, middle and inferior temporal gyrus. As said, these sulci has extended into the inferior parietal lobule of the parietal gyrus and formed supramarginal and angular gyrus. Next, we are going to discuss about the Parieto-occipital sulcus will differentiate into the occipital lobe. And now we had another sulcus which differentiates into the lateral occipital sulcus will differentiates into SOG, superior occipital gyrus and inferior occipital gyrus. And the lunate sulcus will also extend into the inferior surface that you study even in inferior surface, nor even in the medial surface at the last portions. Mostly clearly you can see in the inferior surface, lunate sulci can be seen, which also differentiates for us as the occipital pole of the brain. And in the superior orbital gyrus above, I was being separated by the transverse occipital sulcus, which forms the arcus parieto-occipital gyrus. So this photograph will explain you the superolateral surface of the brain, that is the cerebral cortex. So because we had three surfaces, superolateral surface, medial and inferior. So now we have done the frontal, then we had done the parietal, occipital and temporal lobes. We discussed their sulci and their gyrus. So we done the frontal lobe, parietal lobe and the occipital lobe with the temporal lobe. This is another photograph is of to study the functional areas parallelly. So we can study area number 4 in the precentral gyrus, area number 6 and 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 gyruses, functional areas. Area number 44, 45 when we were studying about the lateral sulcus above pars, opercularis, triangularis area. Area number 312 at the level of the postcentral gyrus, 4 in the precentral gyrus, 5 and 7 in the parietal lobule, and area number 41, 42 in front and behind 22 at the level of superior temporal gyruses. And area number 17, 18, 19 in the occipital lobes. So area number 3, 1, 2 helps in your sensory area, 5, 7 for sensory association area, which were there in the precentral and the postcentral gyrus. Area number 17, 18, 19 in the occipital lobe, just now we have studied over here. For the primary visual area and the visual association cortex. And area number 41, 42 and 22, we studied in the superior temporal gyrus beneath the lateral sulcus area. 41 and 42 for the primary auditory area and the area number 22 for the Wernicke's area, that is the sensory speech area. 44, 45 for Broca's motor speech area. And in front the frontal lobes, we studied the primary motor area, premotor area for area number 4, 6 and 8. This all about explains you the functional areas, and thereby when you go to the superolateral surface of the brain blood supply, we had 3 main blood vessels, that is the superior cerebral artery, middle cerebral artery and the inferior cerebral arteries. So now this is the stem of the lateral sulcus or area. So now when you see the superolateral surface, the outermost margin areas all are being supplied by the branches of the anterior cerebral artery. Temporal lobe initial lower down and the occipital lobes all are being supplied by the posterior cerebral arteries. Branches of the posterior cerebral artery. And the major portion of all the lobes in the superolateral surface, they have been supplied by the middle cerebral artery. When you go to the basics, you know, right and left vertebral artery joins to form basilar artery. They use of the branches called as posterior cerebral artery. These are now supplying on the superolateral surface at the level of inferior temporal gyrus and also the occipital lobes, the posterior cerebral artery supplying. Try to see here the internal carotid artery is giving off 2 branches, that is the middle cerebral artery and the inferior anterior cerebral artery. The 2 anterior cerebral arteries are now interconnected by anterior communicating arteries. So now this anterior cerebral artery is now supplying to the margins of the superolateral and the superomedial borders area. They were being supplied by the anterior cerebral artery. Now try to see from the internal carotid artery, the middle cerebral artery, which is in the inferior surface of the brain, which makes upturn and runs in this. So now it runs in the lateral sulcus, and then they give of branches to the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, and the temporal lobes. So the major portion will be supplied by the middle cerebral artery. This is all about the superolateral surface. Stay tuned to next anatomy. In the next video, we will talk about the medial surface and the inferior surface.